Good morning and welcome to Parliament House. My name is Andrew Banfield and I'm the Assistant Secretary Research Branch in the Parliamentary Library. I'm joined by my colleague, Ariadne Vromen, the CEO of the Australian Council of Learned Academies. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respects to elders past and present. We also acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. Today's talk is timely. Politicians and trust. Prana.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today, and also a big welcome to those that are joining us online via live stream. So my name is Ariadne Vromen. You can call me P. I'm the CEO of the Australian Council of Learned Academies, ACOLA. ACOLA is an independent, interdisciplinary organisation that brings together expertise from across all of Australia's learned academies: the Academy of Humanities, the Academy of Science, the Academy of Social Sciences, and the Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, as well as the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences. ACOLA plays a critical role in fostering evidence-based, cross-disciplinary research to address complex societal challenges such as the one today. Australia's disability responsiveness and energy policies are other examples, and our data-enabled research future. By facilitating collaboration across diverse academic fields, ACOLA is uniquely positioned to generate research that has tangible, broad-reaching impacts, providing valuable insights for policy making and societal impact. We take this role seriously and believe access to research should be accessible to all. And that is why we have partnered with the Australian Parliamentary Library to share our knowledge through this series of seminars to you. This partnership allows us to bring together some of the most brilliant minds in academia to explore issues of profound importance in our political landscape. Today, we are fortunate to have two esteemed scholars, Dr. James Weinberg and Professor Ariadne Vromen, who will delve into the topic of political trust, a subject that has become even more critical in recent years as public confidence in politics and politicians seems to be in decline. As we know, trust is foundational to the relationship between politicians and the public. However, the current climate of scepticism and cynicism towards our political institutions has raised urgent questions about the nature of this trust. There has been much discussion on whether the public trusts politicians, but as today's session highlights, there has been a significant gap in research into how politicians themselves perceive this trust and how it impacts them personally. Dr. Weinberg will address this gap, asking not only whether the public trusts politicians, but also whether politicians accurately understand the trust that has been placed onto them. Professor Ariadne Vromen, who will lead the Q&A moderation, will explore further the implications of these dynamics for Australian politicians, particularly in the lead up to our upcoming election, and how these perceptions could shape political engagement, policy decisions, and the broader democratic process. Through ACOLA's partnership with the Australian Parliamentary Library, we are able to bring these critical issues to the forefront and engage deeply with the lived experience of both politicians and the public. We're excited to hear from today's speakers, so we encourage you to ask plenty of questions and understand that sometimes those questions online are going to be difficult for us to see, but we will try our best. So on behalf of ACOLA and the Parliamentary Library, thank you for being part of this important dialogue. Let's now welcome our first speaker, Dr. James Weinberg.
Thank you very much, everyone, and especially to those who are here in the room and also to those online. Fantastic. The slides are already up. So I'm sure that anyone with one eye on the news will appreciate that the topic of political trust, though perennially important as it is, has taken on an added significance in recent years. Major political events in my part of the world, such as Brexit, and across the pond in America, such as the election of Donald Trump, the second election of Donald Trump, have been characterised by low trust and increasing cynicism and scepticism about politics and politicians. In 2022, the Edelman Trust Barometer, which has been running for a number of years now, declared a collapse of trust in democracies. And lots of this came down to a trust in politicians themselves, or a lack of belief amongst publics in many democracies about the trustworthiness of their politicians compared to other professionals. The Ipsos Global Index I've shared on the screen here shows that politicians a ranking below 18 other professions across 31 countries in 2023. In the United States, where we have the most comprehensive set of longitudinal data, the Pew Research Center has also shown longitudinal declines in trust. This is not merely a blip. Beyond short-term fluctuations, countries that are established democracies, as well as those that are emerging, are seeing these gradual declines over time. And in the US, trust was at an almost historic low going into last week's election. And here in Australia, your own APS national survey last year showed that political parties and members of the federal parliament are trusted less than 14 other public service institutions. And this crisis of trust is also on the lips of politicians in all of these countries and in international organizations that work with them. Here on the screen, I've shared just a couple. You've got Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, talking about how extremely important it is that we address the loss of trust in democratic societies. You've got Penny Mordaunt, former cabinet member in the UK, who spent an entire day at Chatham House running a workshop on trust and emphatically declared, "Lose trust in democracy and democracy dies." And then you've got your own Claire O'Neill, who, when as Minister for Home Affairs, launched the Strengthening Democracy Task Force, identified specifically the loss of trust as part of a series of anti-democratizing forces that task force would seek to address. Now, despite the widespread assumption that political trust as a relational concept is responsive to what politicians do and say, we actually know extremely little about what politicians themselves think about this scenario, how they appraise, cope with, and subsequently perform in a low-trust, high-distrust environment. And it's that black box that I've tried to pry open in my own research in the last few years, and will also try to in this talk. So I'm going to work through 4 questions that are largely underrepresented or not represented at all in the existing corpus of academic work on trust, as well as much of the public discourse. So how trusted do politicians feel, and why does that matter? How much do politicians trust each other, and does that matter? To what extent does political distrust impact politicians personally? And here I'll touch on their health and well-being. And what do politicians need to do or think they need to do to rebuild trust? And as I talk through these questions, I'm going to draw on various studies, some interviews with politicians, some survey studies of politicians in different countries, mostly where I'm based in the UK, to provide some empirical answers as well as theoretical arguments. So let's get started then with the first of these. How trusted do politicians feel, and does that matter? Well, existing research, as well as much of the media attention given to trust, tends to assume that citizens observe political elites and their behaviour, make a judgment about whether or not to trust those politicians based on their perceptions of that behaviour, and then act accordingly. And in turn, our political elites will then be responsive to citizens' expressions of trust and distrust. But in my most recent book, I advance an alternative, and I challenge that assumption that political trust equals policy responsiveness by suggesting that it might only engender effective representational politics and distrust might only stimulate change when politicians share in common understandings of these terms and they accurately perceive the trust or distrust placed in them. This is a missing piece in our discussion of the trust puzzle. Now, the perceptual mechanism which underpins this, the extent to which politicians accurately perceive what the public think, is not new. It's been a long-standing feature of theoretical debates about democratic representation. I particularly like this quote from the 70s from Argy Clausen, who said, "It's widely believed, but less forcefully articulated, that the most durable and effective leaders are those who correctly perceive the attitudes and beliefs of their constituencies." And of course, that same sentiment's featured for hundreds of years in political speeches as well. Yet in recent decades, as we've started to engage in empirical research with politicians, what we see is a story of perceptual inaccuracy. Last year, there was a study published on politicians in 8 different countries in Europe that showed when it came to estimating the public's position on different policy topics, most politicians, at least half of the time, made estimates that were no better than random chance. So how does this play out in terms of trust then? Well, in my work, I suggest that what we've got are a family of felt trust concepts that can be reduced to 3 simple questions that we all might ask ourselves, consciously or not, in interpersonal relations with other people, but which politicians might ask more often given the nature of their job. For instance, am I trusted? Or more specifically, does another person or other people see me as trustworthy, and are they willing to accept vulnerability in their relationship with me? Am I distrusted? Does another person or people see me as untrustworthy, and are they unwilling to enter into a relationship with me at all? And finally, am I mistrusted? Does another person or are other people unsure of my trustworthiness, and do they seek to monitor my behavior more closely in our relationship with one another? So how does this play out then? How do these family of felt trust concepts emerge in research with politicians? Well, in 2021, I started by interviewing over 50 politicians working in 8 different parliaments, both national and local level in different countries. And what I found was that when I asked politicians about trust amongst the public, they were actually incredibly reflexive. Most of them were able to identify and articulate the crisis of trust in their countries and acknowledge that politicians share a great deal of responsibility for that. This Canadian MP saying, "It's about faith, honesty, responsibility, and a confidence that politicians will behave honourably in the way that they say they're going to behave." So far, so good. I then devised survey measures of these feelings of trust, distrust, and mistrust, and fielded them to politicians in a number of different countries. And in my UK sample, I fielded an equivalent measure of ordinary trust, distrust, and mistrust in politicians to the public on the same day as politicians completed their survey. What do I find? Well, on the screen here, you've got 2 boxes. You've got local politics and national politics, and these little point estimates are reflective of the scores for trust, distrust, mistrust, and their felt equivalents amongst the public and politicians in the UK. And what do I find? When it comes to thinking about themselves personally and their own trustworthy characteristics, politicians are not quite as prescient of public opinion. Indeed, when thinking about themselves, elected politicians in different countries did not make accurate appraisals of this low trust, high distrust civic culture. More than 60% of my UK politicians, both local and national, believed that the public saw them as competent at governing. And more than 70% of MPs sampled in Canada and South Africa claimed that the public saw them personally as extremely honest. And this lack of reflexivity raises the possibility of a trust gap that exists whether I break my data down by party or even shared socioeconomic status between the politicians and the public. Here you can see that politicians of the Labour, Conservative and other parties in the UK are equally out of touch with public trust as each other. And this went down to the constituency level as well. So 24 of my MPs agreed to complete another question, single item question, which was, how much do you think voters in your constituency specifically trust you, as opposed to the public in general? And we sampled members of their constituency on the same day, asking, how much do you trust in this particular MP? And 22 out of the 24 MPs still overestimated how much they were trusted. And these are just members of their constituency who voted for them. All right, so why is this important? Well, if we take mistrust out of the equation, it's possibly the least valent of that family of concepts. What we've got are 4 states of either perceptual alignment or divergence, where politicians feel trusted or distrusted, and the public trusts them or not. Now, what we might claim is the gold standard here is cell 1, where we would expect lower rates of relationship conflict because leaders are going to perpetuate fewer violations of citizens' expectations, and they might also be more receptive to and supportive, this is voters, of bold or difficult policy decisions when leaders advance them, because they're all on the same page. What we don't want is perceptual divergence, as in cell 3, where the public distrusts politicians and wants things to change, but the politicians feel trusted, continue to underweight risks attached to their policy decisions, as we see in experimental scenarios, and continue to violate those social expectations of voters. But what we have in the data I've collected, at least in the UK, from the public and politicians on the same day, is a state of cell 3. That's where modern-day Britain is, depressingly, and far from that ideal type in cell 1. So let's move on then. So that's the vertical trust relationship between politicians and the public. But what about politicians' trust in each other? Well, first of all, this horizontal trust is important because it defines the kinds of relationships that politicians build in parliaments, and it often informs their capacity to compromise, for collegiality, and to engage in healthy democratic conflict. And here I'm drawing on a categorization from a Swiss colleague, Andreas Schedler, who suggests that what we want in democracies is ordinary conflict, that normal clash of ideas and interests between political adversaries that gives the public genuine democratic choice. But what we're increasingly seeing is excessive or extraordinary conflict, which is an escalation of that ideological confrontation, which is accompanied by an affective polarization between politicians, which can be distilled to a basic distrust and emotional animosity between those that we are electing to political office. And this is seen most clearly in recent days and weeks in the campaign rhetoric of newly re-elected President Trump. I think this is a particularly eloquent quote. He said, "We have two enemies. We have the outside enemy, and then we have the enemy from within. And the enemy from within, in my opinion, is more dangerous than China, Russia, and all these countries. Take Adam Shifty Schiff, who's a total sleazebag. He's going to become a senator, but I call him the enemy from within." And this kind of rhetoric, especially expressed to the public, is extremely damaging, because it suggests that politicians themselves are engaging in these Manichaean divisions between who they see as the protectors of democracy and who they see as the enemy, and there's no room to compromise between the two or work together. So how does this play out in my data? And again, just focusing on the UK here, because it's where I've got the most research to share. Well, on this screen, what you've got are 3 questions about 3 policy topics: immigration, climate action and changes to taxation, and inequality. And the numbers that are circled in red are the scale differences in answers between those on the left and right in samples of MPs, councillors, unsuccessful political candidates, and the public. And what we see on an ideological level is that the gap between those on the left and right in my political elite samples is twice, sometimes 3 times larger than the gap between those on the left and right in the general public. So what we see so far is possibly the foundation for ordinary conflict, an ideological division between elites that may lead to genuine democratic competition. Okay, but what about the affective side? So here I've just focused on a subsample of my data, which are newly elected politicians in the UK who only entered Parliament 100 days ago. They haven't yet been socialised, possibly, into this climate of excessive conflict. So we wouldn't expect to see that affective polarisation, but we do. So when I ask them, how much do you trust your colleagues in your own party and then in other parties, we see on a 100-point scale a gap of over 30 points. And this is damaging because it trickles over into some of these other items I've shared on the screen, such as the one I've highlighted at the bottom, where again we see an almost 30-point difference in newly elected politicians' willingness to collaborate effectively with colleagues in their own party and other parties. And in contexts where you possibly don't have large parliamentary majorities, I'm thinking here in Australia especially, and that might be the case after your next general election, that is a real barrier to effective governance. Okay, question 3 then. Let's rattle on. So to what extent does political distrust impact politicians' mental health and well-being? Now, you won't be surprised to hear that I often don't get much public sympathy for talking about this topic, but I think it is one that deserves much more attention. Now, when I'm teaching at the University of Sheffield and I touch on this topic, I normally ask my future politicians maybe, my students, to take part in a kind of odd one out round. But for the sake of time, I'm going to assume that you might know who these people are and a bit about their stories. So each of these politicians talked about health and well-being and the stresses of political office in resignation speeches. John Fetterman, top right there, he actually was openly he openly talked about the fact that he admitted himself to a psychiatric unit in Washington with a case of depression that came on as a result of the stress he was feeling in political office. Kjell Bondevik there in the bottom right, he's the odd one out here. He was former Prime Minister of Norway. He resigned from being Prime Minister, saying he couldn't do it anymore because of the stress of the job and he was struggling. But he came back and was re-elected as Prime Minister after having said that, which possibly says something about public attitudes and the lack of stigma on this topic that we see in Scandinavian countries as opposed to others. And thinking about these case studies, myself and a few colleagues tried to come up with a framework of stresses that might impact politicians' health and well-being, one of which was distrust. And this distrust stressor is characterized by the generalized cynicism, abuse, the hostility in spite of effort that politicians have to deal with. And in my interview study, I found that this came through both in terms of the public and at that horizontal level. So here, for instance, a UK MP said, "I've never had a job in my life where people get to sling mud at me and almost assassinate my character whenever the hell they feel like it for no reason. It hurts, and I think that over time that really weighs you down." And a Canadian MP talking about relationships within Parliament. I've worked in the military. Then you really are a team. Whether you're Army, Navy, or Air Force, you're not really lonely. Here, there's all the facade of being a team, but you have to be very guarded about what you say and who you say it to. So the distrust stressor exists, but does it actually impact their health and well-being? So in another survey study with MPs from the UK, Canada, and South Africa, and local politicians in those countries, I fielded a clinical screening instrument for depression that's used in lots of healthcare systems around the world. And in that sample at the moment that I fielded this survey, what I found was that between 20 and 30% of politicians were experiencing moderate depressive symptoms, and between 10 and 20% were beyond the clinical cutoff point for an episode of major depression. When I plugged that into various statistical models to look at the relationship between those scores and their scores for my measure of felt distrust, what I found was a strong positive correlation. If you moved across my scale for felt distrust from the lowest point to the highest point, you saw a 19% increase in politicians' symptoms of depression. And interestingly, that relationship was much stronger for politicians who said that they used social media as their main form of news, which possibly says something about both the quantity and quality of expressions of distrust that politicians experience online. And here an Australian MP summed that up quite neatly. They told me, "I'm on Twitter, which is by and large the darkest thing that's ever entered politics. The only thing that's worse is Facebook. They don't read their comments because if you do, you think your days are numbered. It's the end of your life, never mind the end of your career." Quite somber words. Okay, so politicians might not accurately perceive public trust. They might not have much trust in each other. This is certainly impacting them personally. What can they do to rebuild trust? Or what do they think they need to do? Now, in political science, we tend to take a rather simple performance perspective to this. Perform better, do better in terms of delivering public services, and the public will trust you more. And certainly that bears out in lots of statistical studies. But there's parallel thinking going on in other disciplines around microagency and the actions that individuals can take to change trust perceptions of them and build more kind of resilient, trust-based relationships with citizens. And this came through in some of the interviews with politicians that I did in 2021. You know, this UK MP here saying, "I think probably the only way we can rebuild trust between politicians and the public is by integrity, honesty, by being exemplary in the way we carry out our duties, and of course being tremendously honest." So politicians might be potential co-producers in some of our thinking about what to do when we tackle distrust. And certainly in those interviews, I was able to discern 8 different strategic themes that I group at 3 different levels. There are personal strategies that all politicians can take, both improving and increasing the moments of political contact they have with a more diverse set of citizens to prove without that media filter that they do have some trustworthy characteristics, and changing their communication to be more authentic. And by authentic here, I mean not making big promises willy-nilly, but actually making contingent promises that are honest with the public about the challenges of modern-day governance, and also being honest in their explanations of failure. Institutional reforms around increasing political education so that the public's expectations are a little bit more measured, around increasing anti-corruption measures, changing the electoral system. And here MPs said that they thought a mixed-member PR system might be best because it would encourage collegiality and compromise between politicians, which in turn might feed into a more positive image of, or public image of politicians. And regulation of social media. And then at a governmental level, they talked about policy performance, but they also talked about partisan compromise. Different political leaders needed to take action on showing the public that it's not always a fight. Sometimes you can work together. But if they were actually going to prioritize then, what would they say? So I took those themes, and in my study of newly elected politicians that I've just started, I asked them to rank them in terms of which ones they thought would be most effective. And you can see them ranked here from 1 to 8. Now, policy performance still matters. It's up there at number 1. Politicians are following the thinking we see in academic research. But those personal strategies feature strongly as well. Strategies coming in at numbers 2 and 4 suggest that newly elected politicians do feel some responsibility and understand their own locus of control in changing that trust equation. And political education is up there as well. In the UK, we do a terrible job of educating young people about politics and what it takes to be a politician. And that's something I think that really needs to change. And politicians seem to think it needs to change too. All right then, so I've rattled through a huge amount of content there and probably not done any of it justice, but hopefully it gives you a flavour of some of the research I've been doing. And if we were to take a couple of simple messages from that, what I would say is we've got politicians who tend to overestimate how much political trust is based in them. And that's difficult and damaging because those estimations of trust suggest that they might have a different idea about how much political capital they've got to take risks and to deliver certain policies and continue with certain behaviours that they are executing at the moment. Indicative of affective polarisation, we've got politicians who are increasingly trusting their own party colleagues, but taking the decision not to trust those in our parties, which means we've got less room for compromise and cooperation in parliamentary settings. We've got politicians whose mental health and well-being is suffering as a consequence of trying to govern in this age of distrust. But we do have politicians who have clear ideas about how to rebuild political trust, and they take more agency in that discussion than we might assume. And we might think more carefully about how we give them the space to actually take up that action. Thank you very much.
Okay, my mind's already spinning on all the questions that are going to be asked. We're now going to kind of go into a moderated Q&A section. And for those people that joined us late, I'd like to again reintroduce Dr. James Weinberg as a Senior Lecturer and Associate Professor in Political Science at the University of Sheffield in the UK, and Professor Ariadne Vromen, Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and the Sir John Bunting Chair of Public Administration at the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU and the Australian and New Zealand School of Government at ANZOG. Thank you. Over to both of you to take a seat. And have some water.
Yes, we do. They on? Yes, that's on. Thanks, James. First I want to say it's fantastic research. It's so novel and thorough and multidimensional, so I really applaud that you've done this. I mean, I'm not going to ask the nerdy questions. We're about how did you get access to all of those politicians, but that might be something that'll come up.
I'll share my secrets later.
Yes, okay, that'll come up later, but I just think that's really, I really respect and admire what you've done here.
Thank you.
But there was a lot for us to unpack, so I'm going to unpack a few different themes that kind of relate to your last slide and talk a bit more about that. So I'm going to talk about the trust gap, and then I'm going to ask you a little bit more about I guess how Australia compares to some of that, and then we'll talk about the trust among politicians, and then we'll focus a bit on the solutions, because I think it's quite important for us to have a reflective chat about are the solutions responding to the right problem as well. I think is something to talk about. So one of the first things that I noticed in your talk was again that you understand that trust is relational, it's really important, but also that it's multidimensional. And I was quite taken by that distinction between mistrust and distrust, and whether or not you think that that's shaping politicians' misdiagnosis as well. Maybe they think they're mistrusted, that they're being monitored and people are kind of interested and engaged, rather than it actually is a cynicism and distrust. So I'd kind of like your reflections a little bit on that mistrust-distrust relationship and why you think politicians underestimate that.
Okay. So really good question. Thank you. And thank you for those opening comments as well. So the mistrust, I guess scholars of trust have been debating whether mistrust and distrust deserve to be distinguished for decades, right? And I think in Pippa Norris's most recent book, she makes the case, she says, she's in praise of scepticism. Yeah. What we want is a public that is not necessarily blindly trusting politicians and political institutions, but is actually slightly sceptical of them and constantly updates their estimates of whether these institutions and people deserve to be trusted or not. And we might say, actually, that when it comes to our politicians, we want them to feel more mistrusted than trusted. We want them to stay on their toes, to think that the public is scrutinising them. In that slide I shared where I'd surveyed the public on the same day as UK politicians, actually, politicians were accurately perceiving how much they were mistrusted. It was just trust and distrust where the gaps existed, which is interesting. But in terms of why these gaps might exist, which was the second part of your question, in my latest book, I talk about two pathways, an external pathway and an internal pathway. So how do you know if you're trusted as a politician? Well, the first thing you might do is look at the information environment around you. You're going to look at what's coming back from the media. You might look at the information that your staffers collect from your constituency, or you might base your opinion based on personal interactions with people on the doorstep. Now, when it comes to the media, you're getting an overwhelmingly negative source of information about yourself and other politicians in most modern democracies. So we might think, okay, well, that should lead to more accurate perceptions. Then when you think about the personal interactions politicians have, it's probably the opposite, because they're often engaging with a self-selecting sample of people who are either highly distrustful and they're engaged and trying to protest, or they're party members, they're people who are maybe slightly sycophantic or already believe in the agency of politicians and come with problems to talk to them. So maybe that external pathway, it's not offering as much. So I turn and I look at the internal pathway, which is the characteristics of politicians themselves.
Great.
So in my prior work, I measured the personalities of politicians and people aspiring to politics in different countries. And I found that in all cases, the average personality of a politician was outside the bell curve for the general population, specifically on traits like extroversion, but also grandiose narcissism, surprise, surprise. And these different personality traits feed into other aspects of psychological characteristics and individual differences like self-esteem and the ability to self-select information about yourself to feed your ego. And what I suggest is actually, if we've got politicians whose personalities are leaning towards that end of the spectrum, even if they're getting negative information, they're discounting it or they're underweighting it in favour of the positive information. And that leads to the trust gaps we see here.
That is really fascinating, particularly the kind of personality type that politics, I guess, increasingly attracts. But it's also saying you have to have a thick skin to get ahead.
Absolutely.
Because the whole context is really difficult. We'll talk a little bit about the media and social media context later on. But I'm really interested also about how we think Australia and the UK compares. We're here in Australia, we're kind of in a non-campaign campaign moment at the moment. As
Are we ever not campaigning?
Yeah. No, well, in 3-year terms, probably not. It's sort of constant campaign. And we've come out of the UK election earlier in the year. But even my observation of spending 4 months in the UK earlier in the year, it does feel like the distrust of politicians generally is higher in the UK than here. And I went back and looked at the OECD data that came out in the middle of the year. And it kind of, Australia and the UK are both at the low ends of trust in politics and politicians, but the UK, it does seem to be at the lower end. And I kind of wonder what is it about the UK? Is it more adversarial, or is it this more polarised atmosphere? So that's one sort of what we might sort of speculate would be, why is it so bad in the UK? But the other thing that really comes out strongly in the OECD report is the differences based on class in particular, in terms of how people feel whether or not they're heard by politicians or feel that they have efficacy to engage and make a difference. And that was consistently across a lot of countries in the OECD report, the sort of main driver of trust was that sense of efficacy and also very much the role of class. So maybe
Lots to reflect on there, yes. Okay, why is the UK worse? That's a question I always get, what's going on over there?
It'll also make us feel better, maybe.
Of course. Well, I think, we talked a little bit at the end there about policy performance being linked a lot to trust. And we've had 14 years of, or at least 14 years of managed decline in the UK, where living standards have gone down, inequality has gone up, and the percentage of people living below that baseline poverty line has increased. And so regardless of what an individual politician is doing or saying, there is a general malaise in terms of thinking, is this government, are successive governments actually doing a good job for me? Are there good warrants, good reasons for me to trust in them? And actually, when it came to Brexit in 2016, we'd already had 6 years of maybe the sharpest decline in living standards, and people were misattributing responsibility, some to the EU, a lot to incumbent politicians and those on the Remain side, and actually a lot of the Leave vote was fueled by communities who had, quote unquote, been left behind. So some of it is to do with policy performance, and I get the sense, I know you're going through a similar cost of living crisis here, But much of the data I was reading on the flight over and my kind of anecdotal observations of Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra as well are that things are not as bad here. It is not as visible as it is in the UK at the moment. There is also something about scandals. I know you've been talking a lot here about Albanese wanting upgrades on flights. I think I've got that right. But that kind of pales into insignificance when you compare to some of the scandals we've had in the UK recently. And, you know, the biggest one was the Partygate scandal post-COVID. You know, COVID was an exceptional experience, right, for many of us. Governments had to engage in kind of authoritarian lockdowns to protect people. But whilst that was happening in the UK, we had these revelations that actually in number 10 Downing Street in Whitehall, they were having parties to celebrate small successes during COVID, and the media managed to reveal all of that, and that did huge amounts of damage to public trust in not only the politicians who were implicated, but in the entire political class. And we're talking there only 10 years on from an expenses scandal in the UK, which was also exposed to a huge extent, where we had examples of politicians claiming expenses for duck houses on ponds and ridiculous things like that. So we've got a narrative of scandals over recent years that I think might make your own pale into insignificance. Lucky you. But all of these come together to fuel this situation of distrust.
No, I think it's really important points that you're making. The sort of the public's perception of corruption or misappropriation and the sort of broader scandals are really important dimensions in feeding trust. As are the particular moments in time. I think it's really important that you also flag that COVID and the pandemic was an important moment for that relationship between politicians and the people. In Australia, we had, in 2020, trust was the highest it had been in years in politicians because there was recorded over most of 2020, borders were locked down, we didn't have the significant rates of infection that were happening in the UK and in the US, so Australians felt that their governments were protecting them. That changed in 2021 as we moved into a period of vaccination and access to vaccines was limited at the beginning. So again, you see that trust it's variable. Like it can be really context specific, despite the kind of decline you showed in that chart, in places like the US. So it is possible to gain it back. It is.
Yeah. And those short-term fluctuations are seen in lots of different countries. So that COVID bounce, as it was kind of came to be called, was common to most of those OECD countries. But it quickly bounced back,
exactly.
to where it was. And that's because you see these rally round the flag effects when people are in crisis. We want to believe that those with power are going to take care of us. And so we jump to trusting them more when we're vulnerable. But when they don't deliver, we go back to exactly what we thought before.
Exactly. So the sort of security is kind of a sort of, only a moment. And the other point that you're making there about socioeconomic inequality is really important. Often we in political science don't talk as much about the role of socioeconomic inequality, the lived experience of inequality and how that shapes people's perceptions of politics, how it shapes their efficacy and whether or not they feel heard and understood by politicians. And I think this is part of the trust gap as well, that people think, well, they're not like us, they're quite different, they're living in their bubble, they're breaking the COVID rules, or they have other sorts of special treatment or access to different forms of power. So I think that idea keeps regenerating as well. So really important, and I think we clearly saw that in the American election last week as well. So we need to keep thinking about, how policy making deals with broader issues of inequality as intrinsically related to that relationship between the governing and the governed. So these are really important points.
But also just in there, I'm sure there's no member of the public who would say we need more politicians, right?
Yes.
But actually part of closing this gap is making sure that politicians are properly resourced to meet as many citizens as possible, especially those in the conditions you're just talking about.
Yes.
I was talking to one of your senators yesterday who said he has a constituency of 7.5 million. How is he ever going to do the kind of grassroots action and engagement that he needs to prove to those people he is trustworthy? He can't.
And that's a great point. And it is about how we centre those kinds of engagement strategies about engaging with people. But we'll talk about that as a possible solution too. Because I do want to talk about this broader issue now of the really distinctive part of your research is the trust, not just the trust gap, but this trust among politicians. And I had to go back and look up I had the famous quote in my head, you know, if you want a friend in politics, get a dog. But it's actually Harry Truman. I thought it was Paul Keating, and it attributed in my mind to Paul Keating. He didn't say it, but Harry Truman said it. If you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. So there's this idea that you are the lone politician. Everyone is on the make to gain more power. So, and that sort of comes across a bit in your research. Your politicians seem to be more amenable to people on their own side, but there's this increasing probably gap between how they think about people on the other side of the fence. So why do you think that that's also increasing? I think it'd be good if you could flesh out the idea of affective polarisation for us a bit more and how that's shaping the trust among politicians. And then we'll move on to the second about what could we do to, you know, create more cooperation.
I mean, we often talk about politics and democratic politics especially going in cycles, right? And I don't think what we're seeing here is necessarily new. I think we're just in one of those periods of democratic backsliding where we've entered a really damaging and kind of insidious discourse about binary distinctions.
Yeah.
Right? So in the media, we talk about Leave versus Remain.
Yeah.
You know, the haves and the have-nots, political elites, them and us, etc., etc. And in this current moment where populist politics especially is taking hold in lots of democracies, that rhetoric has moved upwards to our parliaments as well. And I think there's been an assumption that it's all theatrics. It's all just for gaining votes, and we don't really need to worry because there's no substance to it. But my experience of talking to many politicians is that no, you know, this has gone from theatrics to a genuine belief that the other side cannot be trusted to follow through on the common good. You know, when I was interviewing politicians 10 years ago, there was still a lot of caveats to what they'd say. They'd go, okay, you know, I don't necessarily trust them, but I know they're here doing the best by what they believe in. I don't hear that anymore. And I think that comes from the kind of division of their constituencies as well. As the public polarizes, politicians feel they need to serve one or the other. And it's an incredibly courageous and brave politician who tries to strike the middle ground. And it's not a very electorally successful tactic. I think what you need, and I'm really hoping we see it with the Starmer government in the UK, is a large enough majority and possibly a weak enough opposition for your PM and leading politicians to bite the bullet and reach out and show that actually governing by consensus is possible and works, and we need to heal some of those divisions. But in the meantime, it's extremely damaging. A lot of it goes down to how we structure our political institutions as well. So I'm lucky to be based in Old Parliament House while I'm here, and I went and looked in your chambers, and you've got a nice horseshoe. If you come into Westminster in the UK, what you've got are two sets of benches facing each other at an extremely steep angle. And that in itself says a lot about how we've designed our politics. You know, it is you versus us. We're not crossing that line. This is a fight. You know, it's confrontational. It's majoritarian. And actually, that's extremely damaging for trust between politicians. But interestingly, if you step out that main chamber and you look, for instance, in some of our select committee rooms, and you look at the work happening there between politicians on different parties, those politicians involved in that work, well, they do trust their out-party colleagues more because they've spent time working with them on common topics to reach common solutions. It just so happens that they still remain a minority of the entire political class in a parliament of 650 MPs. So what we might want to do is actually, as we move forward, if we're thinking about how we solve some of this distrust between politicians and get them working together better, is think about how we change the design of democracy, how we move more of that work out of the main chamber and away from debate into constructive committee investigations.
And that's great. I was exactly going to use that example, so I'm glad that you already did, James. A former and dearly departed colleague, Ian Marsh, used to always write about Senate committees in particular as being the space for doing a different form of consensus-based democracy where, you know, it's focused on the problem, coming up with the solutions, and people working across party lines. So I think that focus on what we can learn about consensus to move beyond the adversarial, that clearly the public don't like a lot either. So let's think a bit more about the solutions. I was very interested in the themes that came out from your interviews, and that you were dividing them into these individual, institutional and governmental level. And there is a range of possible interventions and mechanisms to deal with this, the issue of growing distrust. But in some ways, the way that they were ranked by your new politicians were unsurprising. They aren't actually about significant reforms. The number one is policy performance. So it's basically we just need to deliver better and do our jobs better, or even communicate better that we're doing our jobs better. And then I think the next ranked one is have more political education. So it's putting the onus back onto the citizens who just need to understand what we do better. They don't currently really understand us enough. So I kind of wondered, how do we get politicians into a broader conversation about increasing efficacy? And you started to talk about the sort of increasing the contact and engagement and maybe the capacity for listening. So I'd be interested to hear what you think politicians think of that and what you think about that as well.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting, right? Because I interview all these politicians and they say, sure, there's a real problem with trust. Here's a load of things we can do. And I say, oh, well, would you back a bill to change the electoral system? God, no, not me. No, I couldn't do it. Yeah. So it's about how do you get them to that line from thinking to action and give them the confidence to step over that line. A few years ago, I was involved in a project that my colleague Brenton Prosser, who's in the audience here, was running in the UK on citizens' assemblies. And they've become much more common in the UK and lots of democracies. And I think you've got a colleague, John Dryzek, who's written extensively on this and deliberative politics more broadly here in Canberra. But I think we could do more to get politicians involved in those citizens' assemblies. At the moment, they're being used to collect public opinion on topics, which is then collated and fed to politicians. That's not the right way to do that, especially if you want to build trust and reduce these trust gaps and actually get politicians to understand the costs and benefits of making these bold changes we talked about. They need to be involved in those citizens' assemblies, and actually, if we make them part of the policy-making process, we get the public into Parliament more often, or we take Parliament to the public, then not only are politicians able to communicate in a way that makes them seem more trustworthy, but they themselves, I think, get a better sense of what's possible, not just what might be possible in an ideal world.
Yeah, yes, they can see the practical ramifications of that. And that kind of contact is really important. I mean, the other, I guess, part that came out in the solutions was both the kind of authentic communication and the role of social media. And you can see that in your interviews. I mean, 10 years ago, when I was first doing research on civic engagement and social media, I was what was called in the field then a cyber optimist. But clearly a lot has changed in 10 years in the way the platforms are algorithmically driven, and they're driven towards adversarial kind of content and a spaces for, not very civic speech at all. So they've changed. So my optimism about social media broadening and creating that space has really dissipated, but there's still an expectation that our politicians are using social media and are available on it. So I guess it's in the broader scheme of things, how we might actually use platforms or use other mechanisms that can broaden the kinds of people that politicians hear from, or where they're collecting their information from as well. So it's not, I'm not expecting you to fix social media or to fix even the media ecosystem more broadly, but it is a big part of this story as well, isn't it?
It is a huge part of this story. I mean, when I was writing the framework of stresses that I had on one of the slides back in 2018, I think I wrote in that publication that social media was an opportunity for politicians, and actually the solution to problems then was actually to train them more into how to use social media effectively to reach a more diverse audience and have constructive conversations. Writing now, I say social media is not an opportunity, it's a problem, and it's a real threat to lots of politicians' health and well-being. I've been doing some work with the Apolitical Foundation. I don't know if you've come across them. They've got really onto this idea of trying to support politicians' health and well-being. And one of the things they've been trialing is a new app that filters hate speech on social media. And they've been trialing it with samples of women politicians especially, because women and minority ethnic politicians get much more of this abuse. And these women MPs are feeling much better about themselves and their agency and their confidence in politics after using this app and not seeing this constant barrage of hate and cynicism and skepticism.
Yeah.
Okay, so that on one hand, that's positive. But on the other hand, if they're not on there and they're not seeing feedback, and who knows what else gets filtered out in the process, well, does that lead to a bigger trust gap?
Yeah.
You know, this external information coming in is again filtered and more warped. Does it lead to decisions about policy, performance, communication that aren't aligned with mass opinion? So it's a really, really tricky one. I'm not sure yet how we solve it.
No, I think that's, very much agree with you there. Okay, I think we've got about 10 minutes left to go to questions from the audience. I've just got a very bright light in my eyes, so...
It's hard to see you.
It is.
Shout out. Yeah.
We've got one coming. Microphone coming.
Thank you. My question was about the nuanced difference between mistrust, distrust, but also expectation of government. I had a local Australian politician recently tell me that she observed fewer younger people reaching for political activism or running for election as a way to affect change. They were looking outside of sort of democratic institutions as, NGOs, basically. And she herself sort of observed this as more of a threat than more of the evil stuff. So is it your view that in modern democracies the expectation government will deliver is so eroded that it's not even so much a question about trust anymore, but that we just don't expect much at all?
That's a great question. Yes, how fatalistic are our modern citizens? Well, I think, especially for generations who've grown up post-global financial crisis, global financial crash, there's not a lot to be positive about. You've not had a particularly good deal from any government, whether that's within their power or not. So it's not necessarily an irrational thought to think I shouldn't have any expectations of my government to help me in my situation. Now, how does that feed into trust, distrust, mistrust? Well, I think there is a point at which distrust gets so high and trust gets so low that people make a choice about whether, and this goes back to work by someone called Hirschman on whether to exit the system entirely, to stick with it and show some loyalty and hope things will change, or to start voicing their concerns and protesting. And I think as trust started to dip and distrust increased, we saw more people voicing concerns and protesting. As it continued, we had fewer who were remaining loyal and even more protest. And then as it's reached almost an extreme condition lately, we're seeing people exiting the system. They don't think that political participation is going to change anything. I guess what we don't know, because all the trends are downward, are whether politicians who manage to regain some trust and rebuild it can reverse that process amongst those parts of populations who've already decided to exit the system. And that in itself is a really interesting research agenda for the next 10 years. I think there's a microphone coming to you.
I can repeat it. Yeah.
So my question kind of builds on that previous question, and basically it's that, so all of this research is about how, trust, mistrust, and distrust, specifically in politicians, and I guess really as individuals and then as representatives of their party. But do you have any thoughts on how that trust might be being diffused from people into sort of larger institutions? And what I mean is, for example, here in Australia, there are a lot of different agencies and bodies. I mean, you can turn on the news and it always feels that like a politician will go, we're making a task force on X, Y, and B, the special envoy for this, or it's going through the department, which will be then tasked by the agency of etc. Do you think that people are feeling a vast distance in their agency to affect the politics of their world, because it's no longer really through individuals, but it's through these kind of amorphous bodies, and so the politician is no longer really representative of the actual action which is being taken on behalf of the constituency? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Great question. There's lots in there. So I guess the first question to ask about your question is, why are politicians creating all these arm's length bodies and these task forces, etc.? And a lot of that, in a modern age defined by distrust, is about blame avoidance, right? So we see a lot in the political science literature about how politicians will use these task forces and arm's length bodies and NGOs they work with to depoliticize their responsibility for decisions that might fail in a context where public scrutiny is high and the costs of failure are much higher than they used to be. So actually, on one hand, this age of distrust is feeding this different type of governance. Now, in terms of trust in the politician versus trust in these organizations and institutions, we used to talk about trickle-over effects. David Easton, a famous political scientist, said you can either have specific trust in individuals or you have diffuse trust in the system and its institutions and actually a belief in democracy. And for many decades, what we saw was that there wasn't much of a trickle-over from one to the other, that the public was quite discerning about being distrustful of a particular politician, but still believing that democracy was the best system of government, and these other institutions like the courts and the police were still doing a kind of public good, and they would trust those but not the politicians. What we're seeing in the last decade, really worryingly, is more of a trickle-over. We've reached a point where the public aren't making those same distinctions between individual politicians and the rest of the political system. And in a number of countries, established liberal democracies, we're seeing people starting to give answers in surveys saying, well, maybe democracy isn't the best system. I would support an authoritarian strongman leader because they're going to get things done, and all these institutions and politicians haven't been getting things done, and my situation is so dire, well, why not take a chance, And so we are in a situation where, as you say, there's this blurring of lines of responsibility, and I think that's a real cause for concern.
I think this is our last question. James can have a well-deserved rest after that.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. One of the differences around the Australian electoral system is the greater presence of third parties and independents. And I was wondering if there was anything within your data to indicate that third parties and independents may actually have different perceptions around these issues than the major parties, and particularly given we have a legislative upper house with power and relies heavily on collegiality for legislation to be passed.
It's a great question, and most of my research has been in contexts where there are big two-party majorities, so I haven't got a lot of data to give you a robust or rigorous answer to that question. What I do have are kind of anecdotal impressions from interviews with politicians from these third parties or independents. And those conversations do mirror what you're saying. So there's a kind of pragmatic realization amongst those politicians, well, I'm here, but I don't really mean anything in the grand scheme of it, of being here, unless I can reach out and find people in these two major parties to work with. Now, whether that is in spite of their distrust of those politicians or actually goes hand in hand with a greater trust of out-party colleagues, I'm yet to find out. But it is a question I'll be asking in this study of newly elected politicians that I've just started. Maybe I can come back to you in a few years and give you the answer.
Okay. Andrew.
Unfortunately, that brings our time to a close. On behalf of ACOLA and the Parliamentary Library, I want to thank both James and Ariadne for what was a really fascinating conversation. Please join me in thanking them. And on that note, go well. Thank you.